I'm Chaz Freeman. Back in 2002, a few people who were concerned about the implications for the traditions and civil liberties of our republic, of the military adventures we were clearly about to embark upon, got together and assembled what became the Committee for the Republic. We're glad to see you all here as members of that committee. The committee has as its main activity the convening of discussions of controversial but inadequately discussed national issues. We hold a couple of discussions each year on the state of our relations with the Middle East, with China, the issue of banks that are too big to fail, and the venality in American government that they help to perpetuate, and other issues. And I'm sorry to say that we have been very neglectful of the issue of U.S. relations with Russia. That does not distinguish us from most of our national establishment. We are here to consider some very consequential and timely questions. Is Russia on the prowl or in a corner? Where does Russia fit in the European state system? What kind of Ukraine would serve the interests of peace and stability in Europe, and might Russia be persuaded to cooperate in creating such a Ukraine? What is the risk of war with Russia? What would be the consequences of such a war? Might it be nuclear? It makes a very big difference whether Russia is on the rise, on a roll, and on the make, or whether it's in decline, fearful, and on the defensive. Which is it? Compromising with a confidently ambitious Russia might stimulate it to seek further concessions. Compromising with a Russia desperate to fend off perceived threats to its vital interests might help allay its anxieties and enable cooperation with it. The nature of the Russian role in the European state system is hugely important. In 1815, reintegrating a humiliated France into Europe on terms that respected its interests ushered in a long period of peace. In 1919, writing a humiliated Germany out of any role in managing European affairs didn't work out quite so well. What relationship do we and our European allies see Russia having with the rest of Europe? What relationship does Russia seek? Which is more likely to enhance European and Russian security? A Ukraine that is neutral between NATO and Russia, or one that is aligned with one or the other of them? Is it better for the EU or Russia to leave this question open, or to resolve it once and for all, one way or the other? If a viable and prosperous Ukrainian state, aligned with neither Russia nor the EU and NATO, is in the best interests of all, including the Ukrainian people, how can we create such a Ukraine? Is the Austrian State Treaty of 1956 a relevant precedent? Hotheads in Washington and Moscow seem to be pushing the US and Russia toward a new Cold War. Is the United States prepared to fight a hot war with Russia? Is Russia prepared to fight the United States? Given the danger that war between nuclear powers entails, we were careful during the Cold War to avoid armed conflict with each other. Is such a conflict somehow less dangerous now? I think these are tough questions. And there's no one better qualified to lead us in a discussion of them than Ambassador Jack Matlock. Jack is one of the great men of US-Russian relations and the dean of America's Russia Watchers. He's a statesman, which means he's a problem solver. He's a professional diplomat, which means he's a specialist in solving problems by measures short of war. He's a realist, which means that he's always seen the difference between the glories of Russian literature and the beguiling disinformation of the Kremlin. I almost said Pentagon. Jack Matlock spent 35 years in the foreign service of our country, culminating in tours of duty as Ronald Reagan's ambassador to both Prague and Moscow. In both posts, he was famously open to a wide range of political contacts. He knew that one should always be in with the outs. That served the United States well when first the Soviet Empire and then the Soviet Union itself collapsed. Jack provided the USSR with an elegant but critical eulogy in Autopsy on an Empire, his magisterial book on the Soviet collapse. In Reagan and Gorbachev, How the Cold War Ended, he gave us a gripping eyewitness account of the transformation of US-Russian relations. In Superpower Illusions, how myths and false ideologies led America astray and how to return to reality, he offered a penetrating analysis of how we squandered the opportunities the end of the Cold War brought and how we might yet seize them. William Tecumseh Sherman famously said that the purpose of war is a better peace. Tonight, we call on Jack Matlock, Ambassador Matlock, to help us consider how to achieve a better peace rather than a cold or a hot war with Russia. Jack? Jack will speak for about, Jack has his own microphone, and he will speak for 20 minutes or so, and then we'll open it to questions. When we do, I think my colleague, the Vice President of the Committee for the Republic, will come up and direct the questions. And I invite you, please, to identify yourselves and ask questions, or if you make a comment, keep it short. Thanks. Jack.
Yes, thank you very much for all those kind words. Yeah, it's really a delight to be here this evening with you, to see so many old friends. You know, for the last quite a few years, we've been basically living outside the Washington Beltway. It's always nice to come back and see friends, though I must confess that I'm sometimes puzzled sitting out in the boondocks at what goes on here. Because there seems to be groupthink about many things in foreign policy that affects both the media and those in the government that, to me, I find more and more difficult to comprehend. Now, I didn't understand they wanted me to talk for 20 minutes. I prepared something that I hoped I could say in 40. Now, so what I'm going to give you is a bare bones summary of how I view the situation and what I think we should be seeing about it, and expect you to ask me questions so that I can actually expand a bit on the details. I think we're in a very dangerous situation right now in regard to Russia over Ukraine. 6 months ago, a year ago, when people were talking about Cold War II, I said, this is silly. This is not Cold War II. The Cold War was about a worldwide confrontation over ideology. It was about communism and the conflict with communism, and it occurred all over. Latin America, Africa, Asia. Now what we're seeing now is a conflict in an area which 30 years ago would have been a local problem in one country. How can that lead us to Cold War II? However, as things have developed, and as I see debates now as to whether the United States should supply lethal weapons to Ukraine, I wonder what is going on. When I see all these debates and saying, oh, you know, Russia's only a regional power, what does that mean? What does that mean, particularly in their own region? And I think that the elephant in the room, which nobody is referring to, is the nuclear issue. No country which has ICBMs, 10 independently targeted warheads, very accurate, mobile, so they can't be taken out. No country with that is a regional power by any means. That can mean other things. The most important thing we did in ending the Cold War was cooling the nuclear arms race. If there are any issues for this country to face that are existential, that's it. Now let's face it. Much as I respect and love the people in Ukraine, and I do know them, I was probably the only American ambassador to the Soviet Union who could and did make speeches in Ukrainian when I went to Kiev, as well as in Russian when I was in Moscow. I do know that country. I know its literature and its culture. I prize it. My heart goes out to the people who are going through hell in eastern Ukraine this winter. But, I'll tell you, if the United States gets further involved in what is in the minds of the Russians, territory which historically has been part of their country, given the present atmosphere, I don't see how we are going to prevent another nuclear arms race. And that's what scares me. Now, how did this all come about? It does seem to me that when we ended the Cold War, we had a coherent policy. Believe it or not, that's very rare in American foreign policy, particularly recently in my time. We did. Our goal, and that of our allies, and that of the Soviet leaders and their successor Russian leaders, was a Europe whole and free. A Europe whole and free. Now, there's been a lot of debate as to whether President Gorbachev was promised that there would be no NATO expansion to the east. There was no treaty signed saying that. But as we negotiated an agreement to end the Cold War, first, President Bush at a Malta meeting in 1989, and then later in 1990, almost all the Western leaders told Gorbachev, if you remove your troops from Eastern Europe, if you let Eastern Europe go free, then we will not take advantage of it. Now, there's no way by moving an alliance that was originally designed to protect Western Europe from the aggression of the East, you move it to the East, how are you going to keep a Europe whole and free? If you have a Europe whole and free, Russia and all the others have to be part of the system. So later, not out of design, but simply, I think, largely because of domestic politics and the East Europeans wanting protection against a threat that at that point didn't exist, but they might in the future, we started expanding NATO. The Russian reaction at first was not that negative, but then other things began to happen. After 9/11, then President Putin was the first foreign president to call President Bush and offer their cooperation, their support. And we got it. when we invaded Afghanistan. We got their vote in the UN. We got intelligence support and other support, logistic support in getting there. What did they get in return? He also removed, without our request, a base, a listening station in Cuba, and one in Cam Bay. We walk out of the ABM Treaty, which was the basis of all of our arms control treaties, and the one which we could deal with each other as equals. We keep on expanding NATO, and not only expand it, we began to talk about bases there, about deploying anti-ballistic missiles for no good reason at all. Supposedly it was to defend the Europeans against the Iranians. The Iranians at that point didn't have missiles that could attack them, nor was it apparent to many of us why the Iranians would ever want to attack the Europeans, what they're going to get out of that. The Russian reaction began to be increasingly hostile. And of course, we had the outburst in Munich in 2006 by President Putin. Now, there are a lot of explanations other than we didn't set out, I'll make this clear, to stick it to Russia. I don't think there was any intent. We had a lot of reasons, and mainly domestic political reasons, to follow these courses. But we were simply ignoring the Russian reaction, the inevitable Russian reaction. And so what we began to get was a reaction from what you could say was at best inconsiderate American actions to a Russian overreaction. And you know, when you set up these vibrations, they can be amplified. Small ones can get bigger and bigger and bigger. I think cosmologists tell us, for example, that maybe all of the universe began with, a singularity, and you get these vibrations. But the process was that we developed an atmosphere which, even before this Ukrainian crisis broke upon us, was one of alleged hostility, perceived hostility, I should say, one of perceived hostility between us. Something that we had, when we ended the Cold War, we had ended. And an attitude on both sides that we were facing each other as not only competitors, but adversaries, and that we were in what you call a zero-sum game. Anything that the U.S. wanted would be to Russia's detriment. Anything that Russia wanted is to the U.S. detriment. That was precisely the attitude that we put an end to end the Cold War. Just a couple of words about how we did it. I was thinking back when we got into all of this. Okay, by the mid-'80s, we were in one of the most intense confrontations with the Soviet Union. The Europeans at that point were talking about Cold War II. The rhetoric was high. And what was the attitude and the policies that we followed then in order to put an end to this? And I pulled out something I had almost forgotten about. It was a memo that President Reagan wrote in his own handwriting just before he met Gorbachev the first time. Simple language, but his insights into how you deal with, at that time, was our principal adversary. And I don't have time actually to quote them. I have his words here. But there were 4 points there that I wanted to quote. One was, he started out by saying, Gorbachev is going to be a tough negotiator, but I have to remember that he has to justify what he does to the Politburo back home. In other words, he's not a dictator. Second, he defined what he considered the three most important areas that we had to deal with. They were arms control, our conflict in third areas, and the distrust between us. The distrust between us. And he understood until we worked on that, we weren't going to solve the other. Human rights, he said, we're much too upfront on human rights. We will get a lot of cheers from the bleachers by beating up on them on human rights, but it will not help the people involved. In fact, it could hurt them. And he went on to say, we've got to go private. It's too important to confront them. And he concluded this memo by saying, whatever we achieve, we must not consider it victory, because that will simply make the next achievement more difficult. You have, in a nutshell, a description, I would say, of what, in the last 15 years at least, we have been doing the opposite. And I think what Reagan understood, he was not a specialist in a lot of these other things. He had people to work on that. What he understood was human relations. And he also understood, unlike many of people on his staff, that the other side are made up also of human beings with their own politics, their own requirements. And you've got, number one, you've got to deal with them with respect, and you've got to deal with them in a way that you don't expect them to do something that is not in the true interest of their country. So our effort then was simply that we needed to convince the Soviet leader, and in this case, eventually Gorbachev, that their past policy was not serving their interest. And it was not. Now, one thing he never did, he called the system an evil empire once, and people would never let him forget it. He also later said it wasn't anymore, but he never denigrated any Soviet leader by name. He would begin every conversation, whether it was the foreign minister or the president, we hold the peace of the world in our hands. We must cooperate. In other words, he met them as human beings, even though he disliked the system for very good reason. He dealt with them with respect. Now, what do we see has happened? I can give you a lot of details when you ask questions about it, but obviously we're in an entirely different mode with Russia. And I would say it's not just the president. In fact, the worst offender by far is the U.S. Congress. And what Russia has been reacting to is what they consider insufferable arrogance and humiliation. Several years. Now, they may exaggerate a lot of that, but it has led to the fact that we seem to be operating off two entirely different, and both of them unfounded, narratives. The Russians feel that we are out, we intend to create a world empire, if not an empire, at least hegemony, and that our goal is to hem them in, to surround them, and to keep them as simply suppliers of raw materials, and determined not to treat them as you might say, equals. They know their economy is not harmed. They know they don't have the military that we do. But is that what we are supposed to respect when we deal with other people? Is there a gradation that the more powerful you are, the more right you are? Our actions in many cases have seen to that. And obviously, this narrative It picks up on some things that are half-truths, some things that are other, some things that are exaggerated misunderstanding. But to them, this is a contest over what is their vital interest. Now, the American narrative, of course, is quite different. It is that you have the recurrence in Russia of an autocratic system that has taken away the possibility of democracy from Russia, has turned it once again into an autocracy and has begun to threaten its neighbors. Never mind that these neighbors that they're threatening were part of the country 30 years ago. And never mind that none of them fought for their independence. It was handed them. But you get these two narratives, and of course, we're reading today op-eds, so, to save the world system of peace, we must provide arms to Ukraine so that they can defend themselves, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. Now, it seems to me, as I'd say, both of these narratives are wrong. Ours is based upon a total misunderstanding of the end of the Cold War. How many have heard we won the Cold War? You were defeated. How many have heard the Cold War ended when the Soviet Union broke up? The fact is, we negotiated an end to the Cold War, which was to the benefit of both countries. And the understanding then was that we were creating a Europe whole and free, as I've mentioned. The breakup of the Soviet Union occurred over 2 years after the Cold War had ended, and had ended definitively. And it broke up because of internal pressures. And that breakup was led by the elected leader of Russia. Now, you have part of their narrative now because of our triumphalism. Yes, they fooled Gorbachev. In fact, some would say the CIA hired him. He betrayed us, you see. They were after us all the time. They wanted to break up the Soviet Union. They're the responsible for breaking it up. Totally the opposite of the truth. And yet, step after step, these narratives, both of which are wrong, at best exaggerated, but both have elements that are simply the opposite of the truth. And yet, both countries seem to be developing their policies on it. Let me add another element now, which I find particularly disturbing, and that is the personalization of the whole relationship. It's hard to read anything in most of our press that doesn't attribute all of the Russian actions to one man, and that man is usually characterized in the most unflattering terms with various things. And this is true both of the media, which of course can call things as they wish, but also of our official spokesman. It seemed to me that if you really want to settle a situation, you don't set up an effective public duel between your president and another person, particularly when the other president has most of the marbles in the question of issue. When President Putin says we're not going to allow the Ukrainian situation to be resolved by military means, he means it. And no amount of shouting about this is going to change that. Now, And for the President of the United States appear to challenge him to do other things simply has a negative effect. Now, I'm one who actually, I thought the President did a fine State of the Union address as long as he was dealing with domestic issues. I know Congress is not going to approve it, but that's going to be a good platform for whoever runs on the Democratic ticket in 2016. But his comments about President Putin, it seems to me, were totally out of place and can only have a negative effect. So I think that one thing that we need to do is to get this personal debate at the top of the government out. We really have to stop that because it's got a negative effect. When you say, oh, I've isolated him, he's losing. Look, you didn't like what I was doing, but this guy's losing. What's his reaction? I'll show him if I'm losing. So who wins from that sort of exchange? But the biggest problem really hasn't been the president. He has been much better on many of these issues than Congress. And I would say one of the most outrageous things that did much to create the atmosphere that we are in, which is one that nobody is going to from, was the Magnitsky Act. Here you have the United States Congress, which at that year could not even pass a budget, passing a law about a court case in Moscow where it was alleged that the lawyer was mistreated and he died while he was in detention. That was potentially a real scandal in Moscow. So what does U.S. Congress do? They pass legislation requiring the administration to identify publicly and take action to deny visas to specific people who might have been involved. One of the things when I was ambassador in Moscow, I would talk about a lot is how we really need to respect the principle of innocent until proven guilty. Here we have a case in another jurisdiction. There may have been a scandal there, there may not have been. A law is passed limiting to Russia, and by name, and when I know one congressman was asked about it, he said, oh, it's not about Russia, it's about human rights. If it's not about Russia, why do you limit it to Russia? And I would point out, this was at a time where the United States had torturers and was not prosecuting them. Was that any concern to the American Congress? It was a time where, since then, we have learned there were several prisoners on death row who were proved to be innocent, and so on. It would seem to me that the U.S. Congress should pay a little more attention. And I'll just say on the whole human rights issue, I think we Americans have to understand, yes, human rights are important, very important, but you do not protect them by public pressure on another country, particularly when you are unwilling to judge yourself. The State Department now for decades has to report on human rights in every country in the world but one. Want to guess which one that is? And what sends the Russians up the wall is many of the language we use, which we don't understand how it's to understand outside. When we say we are an exceptional people, we mean that we're capable of doing good things, protecting other people, and so on. They read it as saying the rules don't apply to us unless we want them to. And we act that way. I'll just make one more addition here, and then we can go to questions. And that is that it seems to me when I really look at what our policies have been, which has given their reaction, and this is not something the U.S. has created single-handed. What we have gotten has been action, reaction, insult followed by also by insult, answered, and so on. So this process is one, I wonder, when I think about how the policy is made, I was wondering, how do you characterize this? And we've heard a lot recently about autism and whether there's any connection with vaccination and so on. And suddenly, I said, we have an autistic foreign policy. Do you know, let me read you. I went back and looked at the actual definition of autism. I think I can find it here, yes. Autism is characterized by impaired social interaction, verbal and nonverbal communication, and restricted and repetitive behavior. When the Congress of the United States votes over 30 times in a legislation they know is never going to become law, I would say that is restricted and repetitive behavior. And our problem is really an autistic foreign policy.
That's great, Jack. Okay, here we are. Tell us who you are and make it short.
Robert Shred with International Investor. It's our understanding that Assad's agreement to remove the poison gas and other biological agents from Syria came only at the persuasion of the Russian president and government. Also, we've understood that because of the current difficulties, we're losing a lot of important intel that Russia was supplying us. In fact, some of which could have been, it could have enabled us to prevent the Boston bombings, for example. So can you expand perhaps on what we're losing by ruining this relationship with Russia?
Well, the greatest danger, as I put it, is that if a reaction to what we're doing in an area where they consider genuinely a matter of their vital interest, it leads them to the conviction that we're out to get them no matter what, the reaction is going to be to beef up their reliance on nuclear weapons. If we're not going to treat them as equals in their eyes, if we're not going to treat them as with any dignity, if we're going to continue, particularly our legislature, to try to mind their business when they can't even mind ours, then what you're going to get is a reaction. And, one of the things that whenever I make these points, you'll get, people saying, oh, he's just a Putin apologist. I'm not apologizing for Putin. I don't like what he's doing. Russians shouldn't like what he's doing. It's very bad for Russia. But the thing is that whenever we get involved, and particularly militarily, and that's why it's so important, not to be supplying arms to Ukraine, which is just going to end in killing more Ukrainians if they use them. If we keep getting involved in these things, we actually strengthen all of those tendencies of President Putin that we don't like and the Russians shouldn't like. One of the quotes I had in my longer remarks was in January from one of their researchers at probably the only polling organization that is pretty honest. And what he said was, the more Russians feel that they are threatened by the outside world, the more they will consolidate around Putin. So these people who are saying we need to get involved in these things, that are primary interest to them are enabling Putin. They like to say that those of us that explain why these things happen are Putin apologists. No, they are the Putin enablers, and they should be made to recognize it.
Ambassador Matlock, good evening. I will not introduce myself for fear of retaliation, and I wanted to say that with all due respect, I disagree with you 100% for the following reasons. All the Americans that grew up in this great country, that went to your universities and entered the State Department, you are not familiar with the evils that the people in the Soviet Union have experienced. You are looking for a reasonable win-win situation when you're dealing with people who are thugs and who do not care about their people. Putin is probably the richest thug in the world who will sacrifice, it's a comment, May I finish? The question is, all right, fine, I'll give you a question. What do you think about the Putin's alleged worth, and do you think that appeasement will work?
Alleged what? I have no idea. I know that a recent book has documented quite a bit, and I think this is something the Russians should be very concerned about. I quite honestly don't think it rates very high in threats to the United States or something that we are capable of dealing with. If the Russians don't deal with it, that's their problem. If we try to do it for them, we're going to create more problems.
Appeasement. I'm sorry, I asked about appeasement as well. Will appeasement work?
Okay, Oleg Merkulov, business and Baltic correspondent from Riga, Latvia. So Latvia is often called the weak link of NATO because of a huge percentage of a Russian-speaking population. In fact, a Russian centrist, so-called Russian, pro-Russian party always wins the election, but it is always in opposition because 3 or 4 Latvian parties unite and form government, so Russian party is always in opposition. But all the issues we have as non-citizens, citizenship issue, language issue, and so forth, are being resolved peacefully. No riots, no clashes, nothing like that. Recently, American tanks and NATO soldiers have arrived to Latvia. So in your opinion, would it rather escalate the situation on the direct, Latvian, Russian, or European, for that matter, Russian border, or would it make Latvia any safer?
Well, I really don't think Russia is threatening the Baltic states. They are in NATO. They will be defended by NATO, and I think they know that. Furthermore, I think most of the Russians in Estonia and Latvia, they want to stay there. They're being integrated very well. If they really wanted to live in Russia, they would have gone to Russia. So I don't think that most of them really want Russia to make problems there. And I don't see that some of the statements made are threatening. But since you've mentioned the Baltic states, I should say, because this is relevant to Ukraine, that in 1987, actually 1989 and 90, delegations of the then newly elected Baltic leaders came to me. I was ambassador in Moscow then, explaining their hopes and plans, first to develop autonomy and then to restore their independence. And when they did, I listened, and then they said, of course, when we declare our independence, you will recognize it. Because we had never recognized their formal incorporation in the Soviet Union. And I said, our hearts are with you. We don't recognize you legally in the Soviet Union. But if you declare your independence, we cannot recognize it until it is recognized by the Soviet regime. They said, oh, how is that? I said, if we do that, you're going to be crushed. If we do that, at this time, you're going to be crushed. Either Gorbachev will be forced to intervene or he will be removed. And as a matter of fact, he was nearly removed when the Lithuanians declared their independence. And I said, you know, our hearts are with you, but you're going to have to keep it peaceful. There are going to be provocations. You're going to have to keep it peaceful, because if you're suppressed, there's not a thing we can do. We can't start a nuclear war over it. Now, why we were not telling that to the Ukrainians, I don't know. That would have saved a lot of problems.
Jack, over here.
Yeah.
Over here.
Yeah.
Thank you. My name is Dmitry. I'm an asylum seeker from Russia, and I have several questions for you. First, do you think that there is Russian troops in Ukraine now?
Of course.
If yes, okay. Do you
obvious.
really suggest Mr. Obama and State Department and Senate and Congress to treat liar like an equal person? Thank you.
I didn't catch the last. You know, when we were preparing President Reagan for his first meeting with Gorbachev, what he wanted was really a briefing, not only about the issues, but about the people. And I wrote 3 of the papers myself. One of the papers was explaining to Reagan the Russian concept of vranyo. It's different from losh. They got 2 words. Vranyo, this is something that isn't true, but not really intended to deceive you. You know it isn't true. It is said to protect one thing or another. A losh is a lie intended to deceive you. Now, what President Putin has been saying is, as I understand it, there may have been quotes that I didn't hear, we haven't invaded Ukraine. Now, obviously, they have sent people in, they've encouraged this. In many cases, they may have had them take off the insignia or sign that they were on leave or something. They were volunteers. I think what he is saying is, you're accusing us of invading. If we invade, and he said this once, if we invade, we'll be in Kiev in 3 weeks. Actually, I don't think it would take them that longer. You invaded Iraq. We haven't invaded Ukraine. When you send your special forces around in various places, do you consider that an invasion? And so on. Okay. This is vranyo. He knows we know what's going on. He doesn't want it called an invasion because in his eyes it isn't. You know, remember in a totally different context when President Clinton says it depends on the definition. It depends on the definition.
What is it? Thank you, sir. My name is Andrei Sitov. I'm also a Russian journalist. I've been based here almost 20 years, so I look at the world at this point, not only from my natural Russian perspective, but also to a large degree from an American perspective. I wanted to ask you, sir, about our relations. You've described a picture that I completely agree with. My question is, how do we get out of this mess?
You know, somebody put in the title what we do about it, and that was in my 40-minute presentation. I'm glad you asked the question. You know, we're not going to get out of it quickly. From the time that we began trying to restore some trust to the relationship with the Soviet Union, took us around 3 years. And it took a different cast. It took Gorbachev on one side and Reagan on the other. We have 2 different, and we're starting now with a very poisonous relationship between our presidents. Specifically, and I think we can't undo this hostility in a few weeks or even a few months. It's going to take a few years. It may take different presidents on both sides. But there are things we can do to ease it. One thing and I hope it's going on, there needs to be a lot more back-channel diplomacy, a lot less public declarations. We've got to get out of this constant public debate over what is going on. I mean, when we have the State Department spokesman and the ambassador to the UN constantly answering Russian propaganda, that's not what we're doing. Of course there's a lot of nonsense in Russian propaganda. Let the media take care of that. Why do you get officials involved? You know? We've been living most of the time for several years now on my wife Rebecca's farm in Tennessee. Now, you know, the people in Tennessee, there's some things they understand very well, apparently better than some of our officials. And one of these things is you don't get in a pissing match with a skunk. You can't win. So let's take those arguments out. Keep the president out of it if you can. On the Ukrainian issues, let the Europeans handle it. Look, if we keep pressing them on sanctions and other things, we're going to split Europe. Because what we're asking them to do is take a very big price, pay a big price, at a time when their own economies are having real problems, when we're paying almost no price at all. And what do we achieve by those? Those economic sanctions are not enough to deter President Putin from doing what he considers necessary to protect his interests, including his own political interests. They help him justify at home the damage that his policies are doing to their own country. As long as we have them up, the Russians are going to blame us. They're not going to blame him. Why do we let him off the hook? So, yeah, I think we should help them find a way to get off this. We should be advising the Ukrainians in their own interest, make a deal, make the best deal you can, stop the fighting. So I think all of those things would help us ease it. But it's going to take a while and a lot of other things to bring back the trust that we had when we ended the Cold War.
Hello, my name is Dmitry Fodiev. I'm with a Washington-based private equity fund that has opened and closed the Moscow office several times. I have a question for you. You've presented a model where the current situation in Ukraine increases Russian nationalism and certainly strengthens Putin's regime, and there's a lot of evidence for this model. But one can think to the contrary and look at the breakup of the Soviet Union to see a combination of reduced oil rents with the escalation of the arms race eventually being one of the factors that caused the system to implode. Do you see this alternative model potentially playing in the longer duration of time with present-day Russia?
I didn't catch all
I guess to put it more, to simplify it a bit, do you see the combination of the escalating arms race with the economic sanctions and the lowered oil price potentially toppling Putin's regime versus the strengthening short-term that's going on?
Well, if the idea is we've got to escalate in order to bring more pressure on Putin to make a deal, frankly, I think, well, of course, we can't control the oil prices. Maybe the Saudis can have some influence on it, but I don't think they're doing that for political reasons. They're doing it for their own reasons, by keeping the price down to avoid more competition in the future. Ambassador Freeman can tell us much more about that than I can. But I think that what we're doing, we're really hurting the Russian people much more than we're hurting Putin. And we're particularly hurting those elements, the private businesses, the private people who are going to have to be the ones that eventually turn Russia around internally. That's the practical effect. Because the guys at the top, they're not going to change what they're doing because of this, particularly when you're challenging them publicly. So I do think that the combination of these things, but I would say that the costs, both political and economic, of Crimea and now the eastern provinces of Ukraine are going to be very high for Russia, and the political costs are going to be quite serious, because this trend of Russian nationalism is going to be offensive to every non-Russian in there, and particularly to other neighbors. I think, this Eurasian Economic Union is already virtually stillborn.
Jack?
And so on, so yeah.
Jack, I think the question was, do you think a policy of regime change can work?
Was that it? Yeah. If that is the policy, first of all, I would say that I think it's a dubious one. So what's going to follow? What's going to follow? I don't know. You think it's going to be democracy? You think it's going to be an open society? You think it's going to be one who can keep all these nuclear weapons under control? Or is it going to be another criminal free-for-all, as the 90s were, without central control over these weapons? The idea that, you can solve all your problems just by removing a leader, didn't we learn anything with Saddam Hussein? Didn't we learn anything with Gaddafi? Apparently not. But I would say if that's the objective, I don't think it's going to work.
Ambassador Matlock, excuse me. I'm Norman Birnbaum, excuse me, the living link between the Committee for the Republic and the editorial board of The Nation in our efforts, as yet unsuccessful, to effect regime change in the United States, but we keep trying. But I do have a question about the Europeans, and indeed the West Europeans. During the horrible days of the Cuban Missile Crisis, it was remarkable how passive Macmillan, Adenauer, even de Gaulle were in the face of the crisis. Nothing they could do, they waited. The situation today is rather different. Chancellor Merkel made quite an impression during her joint press conference with the president, and does appear to speak not alone for a substantial segment of our own country, but for a substantial segment of West European opinion. Our traditional allies, Mr. Cameron has an election coming, and discretion is the better part of valor. So that the interesting question is, does the new Western Europe, with all of its economic and political weaknesses, still, in your view, have the capacity at least to slow down the American apparatus's march to destruction?
Well, again,
How would we
I heard
summarize
most
that?
of came. They took
I'm
the question.
having a hard time summarizing these. Jack's having.
Just the final question. I heard what came before.
How would you?
Well, the final question is: can the Western, can the Western Europeans at least block the American march to destruction?
Well, I would hope they will have the guts to, because they have a lot to lose. And it seemed to me that Chancellor Merkel and President Hollande have been very clear. Weapons should not be supplied to Ukraine. And I think we'd be crazy to go against them on that. But, now, in the case of the Cuban Missile Crisis, it wasn't a matter of being passive. I think when de Gaulle and the others were completely with us, saying they would be with us whatever we did. But in this case, I think we clearly see the Europeans, maybe except for the British, much more skeptical on some of these things, and particularly on the arms. All right, it's their continent, and I think let them have the lead. This is one of my recommendations.
Jack, Ava Spolin, State Department. Jack, as you know, I agree with much of what you said about the situation that we've gotten into, and I particularly would. It's on. Okay. I agree with a great deal of what you've said about the course of the past, and in particular I deplore the sort of name calling at top levels. I think that's really undignified, and I think it would be crazy to give arms to the Ukrainians or to split with the Europeans over this. But looking at the last 20 years from a historical perspective, I think perhaps it can be argued that a lot of this was inevitable. You may say there are no winners or losers from the Cold War, but clearly we emerged in a much stronger position than the Russians. Eastern Europe came out from under the Soviet grasp. Russia was weaker in many different ways, and I think a lot of what happened was simply inevitable because of the inequality between the two countries. And the Eastern Europeans, who were active players in the expansion of NATO, and they didn't want to be left in a kind of gray zone where we and the Russians were competing for their loyalty, and so on and so forth. I think Reagan and Bush tried very hard not to be triumphalist, but I think after a certain point, it was sort of inevitable. And I think you know better than anybody the capacity of Russians for paranoia, which is almost infinite, and to think that the whole world is out to get them. And I think it was an inevitable sort of development in many ways, and we could have handled it better, but
Well,
it
you know,
have been
my only
totally
comment would be that given decisions we made, we probably made it inevitable. It's one of the things that, Susan Eisenhower, who's here tonight, and others, stood up and argued against the original NATO expansion precisely because if it was continued, it was going to bring us into this sort of thing. Now, that was a decision that could have been different. You go on a certain course, and yes, certain other things probably do become inevitable. But I think choices are made, and they make a difference. And we made different choices in the late 80s.
Ambassador.
Jack, over here. Just follow me.
My name is Viola Ginger. I'm with the United States Institute of Peace, but I'm here in my personal capacity. I wanted to ask you to elaborate a little bit, if you could, on what you mentioned about back-channel diplomacy. What specifically do you think would be successful in de-escalating, either now, or what do you think would have been successful earlier in this series of developments in de-escalating the situation? And the second question is, it seems that the logical extension of everything that you're saying is that the Ukrainians need to just submit to the Russian advances at this point and to whatever Russia wants, because Russia seems to see this as a zero-sum game. Is there an alternative to that, and does Ukraine get a serious independent voice in this question?
Well, on the latter, I think we have to understand that Ukrainians are not united when you say Ukraine. It was deeply divided, and those who want to move in a westerly direction are only part of the country. Ukraine's problem was that having been thrown into an independent status, because that's what had happened, with borders that were assembled fairly recently, and without any consultation of the people involved, different historical things. Throughout the history of Ukraine, you had a switch from one side to the other in a country which did not have a federal system. So that was winner take all. Now, therefore, when you say, does Ukraine have a voice? Well, of course they should, but they have not been speaking with one voice. That's one of the big problems. Also, the current government is one which did arise out of a revolution. Back during the Cold War, if there were revolutions in countries that we thought they were communist dominated, we didn't recognize them immediately. Now, this one brought a prime minister that our Assistant Secretary of State had been in during the thing trying to promote. How does that look to Russia? Now, so, when you speak in these generalities, you sort of forget the nature. Ukraine's problem was it was split. There wasn't a single view on this. The East, which historically, for most of modern history, had been actually part of Russia. The West, which almost never was until they were taken in as a result of the Nazi-Soviet pact, and suppressed, so they really hate it. And then you get Crimea, which had never, until for essentially administrative reasons, it was transferred to Ukraine. So one tends to forget all the complexities here when you speak if that is just one voice. One of the problems has been there hasn't been a single Ukrainian voice on these, and this has been exploited by outsiders, primarily by Russia, but also by US and the UN and the EU in recent things. And so this is a problem. But the bottom line is, be realistic. Ukraine cannot have a united and successful society unless it is living in a reasonable relationship with Russia. That is simply a fact of life. And, well, a year ago they could have made probably a better deal than they can now. They can make a better deal if we are not involved. That's another thing. If we're supporting one side, the Russian cost is going to go up. Now, there was also a question about secret diplomacy and what should be done. I remember I was in Moscow last May when, this was still fairly new after the February events. And I was consulting, actually these were people close to Gorbachev, including former Foreign Minister Besmertnik. We had said, how in the world can we stop this where it has started? And the idea was about the only thing they could think of is a private message to Putin that though we're not going to recognize right now the Russian annexation of Crimea, we'll consider it a one-off if they will consider Kosovo and our invasion of Iraq as sort of a two-off. And if there are not further interventions, that might stop the process at that point. Well, I don't know. I don't know whether there is things going on privately. I hope there are. And I don't know what they are. If I were advising, I would have advised an approach of that sort. But there is going to have to be some confidence on Putin's part that whatever the outcome of is, it doesn't end up in Ukraine under NATO influence. He's going to have to be sure of that, and I think he's not going to back down. And, we can all, help him tear up the place, or we can try to find a solution.
Ambassador, Todd Pierce, retired U.S. Army officer. Early in your remarks, you seemed to be pretty even-handed in allocating blame between the United States and Russia as to the cause of our current problems. And just a couple minutes ago, somebody pointed out that with the collapse of the end of the Cold War, we weren't triumphalist in how that ended. But in fact, in 1991, Dick Cheney and Paul Wolfowitz created what was called the Draft Defense Planning Guidance, where they in effect said that it was a winner-take-all contest. We won, therefore the world was now subject to our military domination. And in fact, others have commented, even in the 90s under the Clintons, we sort of pursued that policy, for example, with Yugoslavia. But of course, with 2001, with Cheney coming into power, it became a fact of life. In fact, Cheney said at the end of 2001 that we won't even tolerate an anti-access threat. Somewhere in 2002, came across my desk a statement to our policy being, we won't even tolerate another nation interfering, causing us to hesitate in our decision-making. So my question, I guess, is, and you just pointed out something about Putin's, and it's been talked about Putin's paranoia, but maybe he has a good cause for paranoia, and maybe we need to begin looking inward at the source and realize that perhaps we have a faction with their own country that is intent upon causing as much problems in that part of the world as they can, and that maybe we need to begin looking inward to try to resolve our own inner problem, political problem, and realize that we have a hardcore right-wing militaristic faction that is really intent upon creating all these problems, giving Putin reason for legitimate paranoia.
You know, one of the things in the longer version of my talk, which I omitted, was, you know, I think one of the most profound passages of poetry is that in Robert Burns' poem in Scots English, "Oh, what some power the gift he gives to see ourselves as others see us." Seeing ourselves as others see us. We seem to have a lot of trouble with that. We seem to admire, we must be the leader. What is leader in German? Führer. What is it in Italian? Duce. What do the North Koreans call their president? Dear leader. Leader in most languages and cultures means a dictator. Is that what we want? No, that's not what we mean by that. But when it gets translated elsewhere, and when they see us in it. Another of the quotes that I had, and this comes from State Department Pro's testimony before Congress, we were accusing Russia of shattering the post-war structure of security, which had kept the peace in Europe for 70 years. That statement was actually made. Peace in Europe for 70 years? I mean, Turkey didn't attack Cyprus. There was no war in the Balkans. Soviet Union, you know, and in particular, that the U.S. didn't violate the Helsinki Final Act when it recognized the independence of Kosovo. The U.S. and NATO attacked Serbia, which had not attacked any of the NATO countries, made war against it. The U.S. invaded Iraq, and yet we're saying, you know, Russia, hey, you're violating these agreements. They are. And they're saying, who are you to tell us? That's hypocritical. And frankly, it is. It doesn't mean what they're doing is right. Of course it isn't.
Yep. Hello, my name is Tatiana Harchenko, and I'm a correspondent from Ukrainian Service of Voice of America, so I'm Ukrainian here. And I just want to thank you for your speech this evening. I enjoyed a lot of jokes, and I really like the moment that you can speak Ukrainian. But I want to say that your words that Ukrainians never fight for their independence, it's just disrespect in a way that because it's all not recognition of all those deaths of people who were killed in Gulag, who were fighting in UPA, because Ukraine was fighting for the independence for a long period of time in different ways. And also the statement that our country is divided. According to Novaya Gazeta, which is Russian newspaper, and it's quite independent newspaper, the journalists always go right now and they report from eastern Ukraine. The percentage of Ukrainians who are on separatist side is really low, and we're not divided actually. Ukrainians are fighting for their independence right now. So just these points, right? And I really, because United States and Russia were countries who promised to save Ukrainian integrity, and now you're on different sides. It's different for me why you're asking United States. It's like it's strange for me why you're saying that United States had to forget about the words which were said that United States will be behind of Ukrainian integrity, and to which extent do you think your views on Ukraine is formed by your being ambassador in Soviet country?
I'm not sure.
Chaz,
You summarize for me?
She said that Ukraine has fought for its independence. Has fought for its independence.
Fought for the independence, and they're
we
not
had an
divided.
agreement with the Russians to preserve its integrity. And why did we forget
They're not
that?
divided on
Yes, yes.
resistance.
Yes, she is quite right that in the Budapest Memorandum, there was an agreement signed by Ukraine, Russia, US, and the UK that Russia, well, that all the parties would respect the territorial integrity of Ukraine at that time. That was not a treaty, it was an executive agreement. Now, it did not have any enforcement provisions in it, however, and it was one that legalized the transfer and destruction of the nuclear weapons that had been on Ukrainian territory. There are several things to remember about that, is that those weapons were never actually under Ukrainian control, because there had been a central control. Also, they were scheduled for destruction. Now, the annexation of Crimea is a violation of that. But that treaty had no, as I said, there have been American violations of other things, as the Russians would say. I think arguing legally, and I think Putin has said this, that was with a Ukrainian government which no longer exists because the current government, in effect, threw out the old constitution. Now, that's not a very good legal argument, actually, but because these agreements are made with states and not particular governments. But the fact is, all right, how are you going to enforce it? There were no enforcement provisions there. What are you going to do? Give Ukraine nuclear weapons? Does that solve it? What are we practically going to be able to do? Particularly if, as I said, the fact of the matter is any military supplies that we give is simply going to make the situation worse for the Ukrainians. So I think there is a dilemma there. Yes, that is a violation. And I think the Russians would say, if it's a violation, we're not the only ones that have violated agreements. And in that case, now, I didn't catch some of the other comments, but you're quite right. The Budapest Memorandum was a political commitment of those governments to respect Ukrainian territorial integrity. For that reason, I certainly am one who said we should not, nor should any other country, recognize officially that Crimea is part of Russia. And that's going to create all sorts of practical problems. Of course we shouldn't recognize it. The only question is whether you try, by doing something that's going to make the situation worse, to reverse it when it's not going to reverse it. The only way I can think of is that if you could stop the war and you could get an agreement, because there's no reason for Kiev either to recognize this, is to get an agreement which in calmer times is unlikely but conceivable, that in 3-5 years you have another referendum. A referendum that the OSCE, for example, and if the vote is to go to Ukraine, that it goes back to Ukraine. And if there was provision that Russia would have a perpetual lease on Sevastopol, they might even buy it. But unless the Russians really foul up, which they may do in supporting the people, a vote would probably go for Russia. Now, the way they did it was wrong, but the fact is the people of Crimea had never been asked whether they preferred to be in Ukraine or in Russia. If they had been, it's almost certain that by 60 to 65%, they would have opted for Russia. Now, that's a guess, but then, and you know, when we talk about these principles, one of the principles that the United States has always supposedly stood for, unless we didn't like the people, is the right of self-determination. And so, I mean, these things really get complicated when you begin to think about them, but if you're talking about what you can do practically, I would say that, and when I said that consider it a one-off, that didn't mean we recognize it. Now, when the international community doesn't recognize it,
we're running out of time,
okay.
so we only have time
Just
for
one
2 more
sentence.
questions.
When the international community doesn't recognize it, it means a lot of things won't happen. For example, exploitation of resources off the coast.
Thank you, Ambassador. My name is Dmitry. I'm Russian-American. Came here many years ago, and just as you, I am very concerned about the current state of U.S.-Russian relationships. In your opinion, what is driving the current American policy towards Russia? Because you mentioned a lot of, hostile language and etc. What do you think is driving it? Many Russians would argue that the end goal of the United States is to weaken both Europe and Russia by severing their ties. Do you agree with it?
Did you hear that, Jack?
No, I'm afraid
Did you hear?
I didn't catch, yeah.
Yeah, he was saying, what is the real motivation? You addressed it, but he wanted you to, the Russians are concerned about our motivation. He's asking what our motivation is for the way we're behaving, the current policy in Ukraine or
towards Russia.
You mean what is the government's motivation?
our
My
government?
motivation?
Our government, American government.
Well, I think you need to ask them. As I've said, I would have advised against a number of things that happened. I do think that such things as the Magnitsky Act, which is passing legislation about things that are not under our jurisdiction, which cause an effect that actually is the opposite of what you want, is a stupid thing to do. Because if it is to support human rights, you're going to damage them from the way you do it. So I would say, a lot of this resolutions and so on that are coming out of our Congress are counterproductive because they're supposed to achieve a given end, but practically speaking, they achieve the opposite. And Congress isn't supposed to be making foreign policy anyway. So, but I guess my own feeling was that we should have then, and now we should try to find a way gradually to restore it, the whole idea of a Europe whole and free. And that means open borders and so on. It does mean that some countries are going to have different systems. It means that the concepts of rights are going to be different in some than in others.